3 essential scuba skills that new divers and not so new divers must master in order to be a safe and competent diver. Let's talk about it. All right, top of the list, buoyancy control is the #1 skill. I mean, come on, we got to put buoyancy at top of the list. There is no other skill more important than buoyancy control. I mean, if we can't maintain our position and have some sort of control while we're diving, the rest of the skills are not going to matter. So I always tell my students, we're not supposed to be down there. And so this is a hobby that I feel really requires the time, the dedication, and the effort to make sure that we are moving towards becoming a safe and competent diver. And buoyancy control is the #1 skill to make sure we can get there. Okay, so 3 areas of buoyancy: neutral, negative, and positive. Neutral is pretty self-explanatory. I want to be able to maintain my position in the water column during my dive. It means I'm neutrally buoyant. I'm not putting any air in. I'm not taking any air out. Negative buoyancy, of course, it means I'm sinking. But if I'm sinking in a controlled way or descending in a controlled way, that's okay, because I know when I get to where I'm going, I can become neutrally buoyant. And so positive buoyancy, of course, means I'm ascending. I'm getting shallower. And again, if I can do that in a controlled way, perfect. But there is risk in terms of my ascent rate. And of course, if I'm unable to control my buoyancy on the way back up, now I'm running some risk. So all 3 matter during the course of your dive. So what does great buoyancy look like? #1, I would say for me, is control. If I look at a new diver, the first thing I'm looking at is, are they in control? Are their hands or fins moving all over the place to maintain that position? So great buoyancy to me means a combination of the low pressure inflator, but more importantly, using, once you're at depth, your lungs, the inhales, the exhales to maintain your position in the water column. And if you're doing that without a bunch of hand movements and a bunch of finning, then to me, that is great buoyancy. So let's go over a couple of reasons why buoyancy is important. And the #1 thing has to be safety. Safety is the #1 thing. If you have poor buoyancy, that likely means you have poor descent control and poor ascent control. And those things from a safety perspective are key. If you're on and off your low pressure inflator all the time, well, you're going to burn through air probably faster than your dive buddy. And guess what? The dive is going to have to end a little quicker. If you are always stressing on your dive, trying to maintain your buoyancy, that's just not fun. It's stressful. And so the opposite is also true. If you've got your buoyancy locked in, the dive just becomes a ton more fun because you have free time to look around, interact with your buddy, interact with the environment, and just sort of explore. We have to do our due diligence to ensure that we have enough control so that when we are interacting with these environments, we're not damaging or harming them. You may be descending down onto a beautiful old wreck, but the last thing you want to do is have poor control where you have to hold on and hang on to it. And the same rings true that if you're on a beautiful reef, you don't want to be touching the reef, you just want to be exploring and enjoying the reef. So those are the areas of why buoyancy control matters. How do we master buoyancy control? Because we've just said it's the #1 skill, and so how do we go about doing it? And the first thing I'm going to remind you of is the weight check. The weight check before you go any further in trying to improve your buoyancy control has to be done. You must have proper weighting before you can actually fine-tune your buoyancy control. It's that simple. So guess what? I have a video on the weight check in our YouTube channel. And that's a shameless plug, by the way. So really what it comes down to is less equals more when it comes to lead. And really you want to get to the point that you are only taking enough lead with you to finish your dive safely. I highly recommend new divers to take a peak performance buoyancy course. I didn't take the course, and honestly, I feel like it hindered my progress back in the day. I eventually caught up, but it took a bit of time. New divers have to be more patient. And because they take an inhale or an exhale, they're expecting changes to happen right away. But it doesn't work that way. It's a 2 to 3 second delay before those changes happen. And so if you're not careful, you might take a big inhale expecting yourself to rise and nothing happens. And so what do? Well, you take another inhale. And of course, by that time, you're already starting to rise, and now it's just a compounding problem. And before you know it, you're at the surface going, hey, Dave, I don't know what happened there. No one is going to be surprised to hear me say this, is practice. Listen, man, you got put into practice. If you want to be good at anything, I don't care if it's diving, riding, running, you name it, man, you got to practice. And so diving is no different. And by the way, none of us came into this as expert divers. The folks who are good at diving put in the time. They practice the core skills, exactly what we're talking about today. So all that to say, practice, practice, practice. What I see new divers do a fair bit is they want to go out and they just want to chase the number of dives. I know, because I did that as well, at least for a little bit, until I realized, man, I am really bad at this, and I probably need to slow down on the number of diving I'm trying to get done and just go and get some quality time in to practice these core skills. It's almost a guarantee that if you have a local dive community, there is a local dive spot to practice. And what I mean by a local dive spot is a controlled body of water that you can go and practice and hone in all of these core skills that we're starting to talk about. So find the spot, talk to your local dive shop, figure out where it is, grab your dive buddy and say, hey, it's time to go and practice these core skills. Trust me, the investment will pay you dividends further down the road as you start to progress in your dives. So find creative ways to practice. And the brain is kind of funny. If you give it tasks to work on underwater, all of a sudden it'll start to focus less and less on actually trying to maintain your buoyancy. So for instance, I'll work with students or even buddies, and we have a bottle game where we have a bunch of bottles lined up on a concrete bench underwater, and it's like a bit of a chess match. You know, I push one forward, they push it back, and vice versa. And if you're not touching the bench, whoever touches the bench first, of course, loses. And it's a bit of a challenging thing, and over time, you'll find that you're getting better and better and being able to maintain your buoyancy. Why? Because you're not actually focused on maintaining buoyancy. You're more focused on the task at hand. So the next challenge I always sort of show folks how I learned is I would take a scrub brush, and I have a scrub brush here, and I would take it out to our local spot. We have a great underwater statue park at Centene, Brockville, Ontario. And I would go scrub statues. And the whole point was not to touch the statues, but get it to the point where I could maintain my buoyancy while I'm scrubbing the statues as I'm going around. This was also a great way to trick the brain into the task and then less worry about the actual buoyancy control. And over time, I got pretty good at not having to touch the statues, but yet being able to clean the entire statue. Now, I will say I have seen some divers on my way back into shore doing the old statue clean trick, but as I do a double take, they're actually like holding on and then, scrubbing the statue. This is really not working on your buoyancy control. You're just cleaning statues. And I'm pretty sure the statues don't care if they're clean or not. So if you're going to take the time to work on that and those kind of skills, challenge yourself. It's okay if you can't do it in the beginning. Eventually, it will get better and better to the point where it just becomes second nature. I always like to stress that 20 feet is the magic number to dial in your buoyancy. This is where you start, because buoyancy at 60 feet is pretty easy. Buoyancy for a new diver at 20 feet sometimes can be a bit challenging. And of course, as we all know, that's where our safety stops are. So if we really want to dial in our buoyancy, 20 feet is probably a pretty good spot to dial it in at, just so that we'll be good at our safety stops. And then once you can become good at your safety stop at 20 feet, then I challenge you to take it to 10 feet. If you can control and maintain your neutral buoyancy at 10 feet, trust me, all other depths will be easy. 10 feet for me is the magic number in terms of really dialing in and fine-tuning the buoyancy control. If you can stay at 10 feet neutrally buoyant, do a mass drill, maybe take your SMB out and deploy it, now you are really starting to get in the window of having great buoyancy. So these are all tips and tricks that I used back in the day to improve my buoyancy, and I still use them today, either with students or if I'm on my own trying to keep myself rust-free in terms of buoyancy control. So a few common mistakes new divers make. Of course, number one, massively overweighted, too much lead, haven't done a proper weight check. This right there will hinder all of your buoyancy control progress if you're not careful. The low pressure inflator and the cycling of it is the next thing that you see a lot with new divers. It's on, off, on, off, on, off. So have to avoid that. Learn to use the lung control to fine tune your position. The next thing is chasing the dive count and not trying to get enough practice in. Just because you're going on a dive doesn't necessarily mean that you're improving your skills. You may be going on a dive that's pushing your stress levels to the point because you're not ready for it, that there's no time to practice and you're just trying your best to get through the dive. Well, at that point, you're not really learning much, and I would ask, how much fun really was it? Struggling to control the speed of their descent, and then of course the ascent, is something that you also see with new divers. And that is really all about that relationship between the low pressure inflator and your lung control. So self-awareness we'll talk a little bit about later, but that is really huge, because if you are self-aware, it also means that you are capable of assessing yourself and realizing all the different areas that you need to put the time in and improve. But this is not a common thing, especially with new divers. Okay, so that covers up buoyancy control. Next up, we're going to talk about fin control, so get ready. Coming in at number 2 core skill is fin control. And before we go any further, I would highly encourage you to buy or invest in a quality set of fins. Let's take a moment to talk about why fin control is important. Well, number 1 is air consumption and efficiency. If you are moving around in an efficient way using your legs, then of course you are going to burn less air. And then probably even more important is that if you've gone away from the power kicking and into more of a frog kick style, well, now you are directing the water energy horizontally versus vertically, which means less likely to silt and kick up the bottom. So that is a pretty huge difference. Fin control is also something we talk about in the Peak Performance Buoyancy course. We use a reference line and we start to show folks how to frog kick. In the beginning, and I've heard 8 million times, Dave, my legs just don't move like that. My ankles don't move like that. And I remember the days where I would watch great divers dive around, and I thought, no way in hell are my legs ever going to move like that. And it just took time. That's all it was. And I just worked at the frog kick and worked at it until it just became second nature. And now it's to the point where it's almost more difficult for me to power fin, which is actually kind of comical considering where I came from. So the frog kick technique, the modified frog kick, is certainly something that you want to throw into your arsenal in terms of you being a diver. This will take time developing that muscle memory and the technique, but again, it's just about the practice. So the one thing I like to remind students about when we're talking about fin control is diving is not supposed to be an athletic event. The more we can move towards becoming a graceful diver that is efficient moving through the water column, the better divers we will be. There are many different finning techniques. Of course, we all learn to power or flutter kick in the beginning, and then we have a modified flutter kick. And then, of course, we go into a frog kick, which is definitely a more efficient way to fin. And then that becomes into a modified frog kick depending on when we need it. Of course, there's a helicopter kick. And then there is the most coveted back kick, or the back finning technique. And that is going to take a lot of time to master. So common mistakes that new divers make when we talk about fin control. Well, number 1 is they did not invest in a quality set of fins. You see that a lot. Number 2 is they still think it's an athletic event. And so as soon as they start power thrusting, off they go. What they don't realize at the end of the dive is, wow, why am I so much lower on air than everyone else on the dive? Let's talk a little bit about the famous word that we beat to death in the last segment, practice. This is no different. You simply want to head to a controlled dive spot and find some time with your buddy to practice your finning control. What I typically like to do in a Peak Performance Buoyancy course is we will run a reference line, and then I will have students try to fin next to the line to keep themselves on the line but not touching the line, to sort of just give them a little bit of a reference point to help them as they're learning to frog kick. But the more time you can invest early on in the frog kick, again, the more it's going to pay off for you as a diver. So not a ton of information here in terms of fin control, other than to say it is definitely core skill number 2. And the quicker you can learn and master the frog kick technique, the more efficient diver you will become. So get to it, man. Start practicing. Core skill number 3 is what I would call trim. And I feel like there are 2 areas that we can improve, especially as new divers. So the first one is all of that hanging off your BCD, get rid of it. You don't have to one-arm everything off the dive accessory shelf to hang it off your BCD in order to become a great diver. Trust me, I've gone down that path. It does not work. Everything that you have hanging off your BCD is going to cause drag in the water column. So if you've just spent a ton of time getting your buoyancy under control, and now you have a great frog kick that you can use, why destroy it all by having a ton of stuff hanging off your BCD causing you a bunch of drag as you're trying to swim through the water? So anything that you absolutely need, you either have it in your BCD pockets or the tech shorts, but make sure that it's not hanging down and creating drag. So the next part of trim is probably even more important, and that is, what is your positioning as you're diving? If you are going through the water column looking like a seahorse, honestly, don't be a seahorse. Now, I know seahorses are cool, but divers that look like seahorses are not cool. You want to basically work on a horizontal positioning so that you are nice and trimmed out. You don't have a ton of stuff hanging, creating drag. Now you've got good buoyancy control and you've got a frog kick. Well, guess what? You are now going to start to glide through the water column efficiently. And guess what that means? Better air consumption. But again, no surprise, this is going to take practice. The last part I will touch on trim is weight distribution. This can really affect your ability to really horizontally trim yourself out in the water column. So it is something that you absolutely need to work on in terms of where you are putting your weights. And so you may have to move some around just to sort of trim yourself out horizontally and fine tune that positioning. The last piece to that, of course, is your fins. If you tend to be leg light, then you might need a set of heavier fins to bring your legs down. And the opposite will also be true. So this is all part of the fine-tuning process that you will go through as you're starting to really focus and dial in your trim. Here's the great news. We talked about buoyancy control and the weight check, fin control, trim, and now you get to go back in the drawer, grab your GoPro, take your buddy to the dive spot and film a practice session. Take the footage home and review it and use it to continue to improve and fine-tune your setup so that you can get to the point where you are a safe and competent diver. Now that is an effective use of the GoPro. Hold on a sec. I know I promised a fourth skill, but guess what? It's not even a diving skill. It's actually just a life skill, and that is humility. As a new diver, you have to be ready to embrace humility and check the ego at the door. You are going to have to be able to take feedback. At times, it might be critical, but someone in the dive community who is giving you feedback is actually someone who cares. So take the time, listen to the feedback, don't be afraid to ask for help, and always remember that as a new diver, you have lots to learn. This is a hobby that can be very unforgiving if you're not careful. So remember, stay humble, embrace humility, check the ego, practice hard, dive safe. To grab your GoPro, what is a GoPro? It's late. It's been a long day. We're close. We're close there. We almost frickin' had it. I felt it. It is so close right now. It's right there. And I just cannot extract it. Like my brain sees it and the lips don't move. Grab the GoPro. It's the GoPro. This is gonna be the blooper reel is going strong right now. God damn. You get to grab your GoPro. Man, this is a tough one tonight. This one's tough. Right as they're power finning through and kicking up the bottom because their fin control sucks. I f***ed that up.